Welcome to the fifth video we are doing here at Ubi Petrus. As a significant amount of research, editing, materials, and time go into these videos, your support on Patreon is greatly appreciated. It allows us to create more content like this and at much more regular intervals. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share our videos on social media. All video and audio clips not produced by us found within this video are covered under the fair use laws as described in Title 17, Chapter 1, Section 107 of the United States Law Code. In February 2021, Erick Ybarra was invited onto the YouTube show Pints with Aquinas by its host, Matt Fradd, for a debate with the Orthodox priest, Father Patrick Ramsey. The topic of the debate was whether or not the tenets of Vatican I can be proven to have existed in the first millennium. Father Patrick did well in the debate, and that is not just my opinion. It is the largely Roman Catholic viewing audience who, when polled on who the victor was, 63% of them stated Father Patrick was the victor, while only 37% considered Erick Ybarra the victor. That is remarkable considering that, as mentioned, the majority of the viewing audience is Catholic, so one would expect the majority of votes to go largely to Erick Ybarra, but instead, the largely Catholic audience voted largely in favor of Father Patrick. Some blamed it on the shortage of time, but that would have also hindered Father Patrick. Others pointed out that it could have been the audience was mesmerized by Father Patrick's melodic Kiwi intonations, since he was from New Zealand. But the most likely reason they went so heavily in Father Patrick's favor is that Erick was just simply wrong, no matter how many supposed examples he could bring up. Regardless, the viewers decided, and in a debate, it is not up to the debaters to decide who won. Rather, in a debate, the audience is the judge, jury, and executioner of the strength and validity of one's argument, and the jury opted to ruthlessly and publicly execute Mr. Ybarra's argument by almost a two-thirds majority. Quite the landslide. Now, before we begin, a few comments need to be made. Erick Ybarra had initially appeared on Pints with Aquinas on November 25, 2020, for a somewhat underwhelming interview entitled, Should We Become Eastern Orthodox? In response, on November 29, 2020, David the Real Med White, Seraphim Spillman, and our favorite neo-Frank, Sneck, joined two members of the Ubi Petrus crew to create a reply entitled, Refuting Erick Ybarra and Matt Fradd. Yes, you should become Eastern Orthodox. A day or two later, Matt Fradd appeared in the comments under our video offering to host a debate between us and Mr. Ybarra or someone else. Now, rather than read each of these out, you can simply see the images yourself and see we are not making this up. We gladly accepted and stated that, if nothing else, we could have a friendly chat. He approved, but was concerned about posting his email publicly and asked for ours. We thanked him for reaching out and gave him two different ways to contact us. And for the following 2.5 weeks, we heard nothing from Fradd, and then, suddenly, this debate announcement appeared. The next day, Fradd emailed us this. Now, because we actually keep our word here, we are not going to dox Matt Fradd's email address, as humorous as some might find that, despite the fact he ghosted us. We do not think Matt is a bad guy. After all, he did extend the offer to us on his own accord in the first place. But what is ironic, if not downright hypocritical, is why Erick Ybarra, a guy who has no formal training in ecclesiology, history, linguistics, or philosophy, would require and moreover think himself worthy of an opponent who is a verified scholar. Part of it is an excuse to not engage with us. Part of it is pure Dunning-Kruger. It should be noted, and happily, that in our debate with Suan Sona on April 10, 2021, Matt Fradd again showed up in the comments section and left this reply. Considering Fradd did not even know about us until his initial discussion with Erick Ybarra, when viewers had repeatedly asked when Ybarra would debate us, and considering Fradd had recently had on both Lofton and Ybarra multiple times, it is more than likely he heard the slander from Michael Lofton, Erick Ybarra, and the rest of the Reason and Theology cast. This is a life lesson. It pays to tell the truth about others and to avoid slander at all costs because, if nothing else, when you slander another person, sooner or later, you will be found out to be a liar and you will lose credibility in the eyes of others. Some of the material Mr. Ybarra presents in the debate is handled in an earlier video we did entitled Refuting Catholicism: Why Erick Ybarra and Catholicism Are Wrong on Church History, as well as in detailed blog posts on our website, www.ubipetrusibecclesia.com. And so, though we will touch on these topics, we will periodically direct the viewer to the blog and other videos of ours for further clarifications so that this video is a manageable time length. Additionally, though we will periodically comment on the contents of the post-debate review held on Reason and Theology, we will handle that in a separate video, but that review is timed and therefore essentially just a second debate in substance. But even in the debate review, Father Patrick crushes Erick again, as Mr. Ybarra simply cannot get his head around basic ideas Father Patrick presents, and so Erick begins to show a sort of desperate agitation and frustration towards the end. Perhaps learning from Matt Fradd's mistake, Michael Lofton did not put up a poll asking who came out ahead in the debate review, and probably for the better, as being officially humiliated on two different Catholic channels would look really bad for Mr. Ybarra. But throughout both the debate and the review, the impression one gets is Mr. Ybarra is just a simple guy who has stumbled into issues that are perpetually way too big for him, but he is too proud and, perhaps, too oblivious to bow out or take a back seat and listen. No one can say that Mr. Ybarra should not comment on these topics, though. There is nothing wrong with non-scholars commenting on scholarly or academic topics, whether they be history, theology, philosophy, linguistics, etc. But as a professor friend once said, one must not be a scholar to have academic debates or write books, as long as they are following the literature. But if one wants to depart from the literature on any point, they had better be a scholar. As you will see throughout this, Mr. Ybarra cannot seem to follow either path, as he neither follows the literature as a non-scholar, nor has the qualifications and knowledge to depart from the literature as he insists on doing. With that, we begin. Mr. Ybarra states openly he is trying to prove the First Vatican Council's Pastor Aeternus is part and parcel of the apostolic tradition, and so would have been present in the first millennium church.
The question before us today is whether the doctrine of papal primacy as formulated at the Council of Vatican I is taught in apostolic tradition. Let me begin by defining the Council's definition. The Council's decree, Pastor Aeternus, which means the eternal shepherd, referring to Jesus Christ, gives a definition in 4 parts. These 4 parts describe 1, the institution, 2, permanence, 3, nature, and 4, infallible prerogative of papal primacy. I will explain each of these briefly. The institution. The Council states that the Apostle Peter was given a primacy over the universal Church of God directly and immediately from Jesus Christ, the eternal shepherd. The permanence. In order to maintain the Church's episcopal government as one and undivided, this universal primacy must be permanent as a perpetual principle of unity until the end of time, fixed in the bishopric of the Roman Church, according to the authoritative design of Jesus Christ. The nature. This primacy is universal and jurisdictional, or legally binding. This jurisdiction is immediate, direct, and ordinary over the whole Church of God. This is founded upon the fact that full power to govern the Church was directly given to Peter with no intermediation. As such, Peter and the person of his successors are the supreme judge of all the faithful, and is free to exercise his authority at will. Infallible prerogative. Included in this primacy is the supreme power of teaching, or magisterium. On certain conditions, the Pope can propose unchallengeable teaching that is protected from all error, and which must be adhered to with the assent of faith, the refusal of which would result in excommunication.
Erick does a decent job of summing up Pastor Aeternus, but in so doing, he sets himself up for failure by revealing just how restrictive the framework is into which he must fit all of his material. He also leaves out that many non-infallible papal statements are binding upon the faithful, not simply through Vatican II's Lumen Gentium chapter 25, but also through encyclicals such as Pope Pius XII's Humani Generis chapter 20. Mr. Ybarra, as we will discuss in the section on the LIbellus of Hormisdas, is about to go against the grain of the official interpretation of Vatican I, that by Bishop Vincent Ferrer Gasser. You see, when the First Vatican Council convened in 1870 and they drafted Pastor Aeternus, it was realized that the document would, without a doubt, be construed in ways that were counter to its intent, and in order to make sure no such confusion could or would take place, one bishop was specifically tasked by Pope Pius IX to produce a document clarifying exactly what is meant by Pastor Aeternus, and this work was then ratified by the Council en toto as the official interpretation of Vatican I's fourth chapter of Pastor Aeternus. This work, commonly known as Bishop Gasser's Relatio, but formerly known among the Council's documents as the official Relatio on Infallibility of Bishop Vincent Gasser at Vatican Council I, was translated into English with a very good commentary by Father James T. O'Connor, published by the Daughters of St. Paul in 1986, and possesses both a nihil obstat and an imprimatur, and was published under the title The Gift of Infallibility. The translator and commentator, Father O'Connor, makes clear the importance of the Relatio, stating, quote, "Central to all the discussions on the meaning of papal infallibility, as Vatican I defined it, has been the official presentation, the Relatio, made by Bishop Vincent Ferrer Gasser to the General Congregation of Bishops of Vatican I, which took place on July 11, 1870. Father O'Connor follows by saying, quote, "So important is the Relatio of Gasser that it has itself become a theological source, cited in innumerable manuals and theological treatments, and serving even in our own times as a key element in the renewed theological discussions about infallibility. Indeed, the Second Vatican Council in its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, cites Gasser's Relatio 4 times in its important chapter on the magisterium or teaching office of Pope and bishops. Paragraph number 25 has approximately only 55 lines of text and 8 official footnotes. Thus, half of the citations in that key section of Vatican II's Lumen Gentium are to Gasser's Relatio." He then goes on to state, quote, "The deputation then entrusted to Gasser the task of relaying its recommendations and of giving an official explanation of the meaning of the amended draft, so that the bishops would know precisely what they were voting on when they came to approve or reject the proposed chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus. It is in this aspect of his task that the importance of Gasser's Relatio can be discerned. It is the key to proper interpretation of chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, as it was finally approved, since the bishops voted on it as explained by Gasser, representing the deputation de fide." End quote. Needless to say, the Relatio is a big deal. It's a very big deal. With that in mind, we come to our main point. Gasser's Relatio gives 3 examples he believes are the strongest testimonies to the Church believing in the infallibility of the Pope. 1 example from the first millennium, and 2 from the second millennium. From the first millennium, he chooses the libellus presented to the Byzantines at the Council of Constantinople 869, not the original LIbellus of Hormisdas from the early 6th century, but the altered version of the LIbellus of Hormisdas used by Rome at Constantinople 869. He believes this is the strongest, albeit indirect, testimony in the first millennium. It must be stressed that Bishop Gasser does not consider these 3 examples, or any of the classic proof texts for papal infallibility Mr. Ybarra brings up, quotations from saints such as Irenaeus, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, etc., as direct testimony, but instead describes them as indirect testimonies. Father O'Connor states, quote, The patristic texts adduced by Bishop Gasser can hardly be taken as clear indications of their author's belief in the infallibility of the Pope, as Vatican Council I was going to define it. Gasser himself has indicated that the statements of the Fathers which he has brought forth fall under the category of indirect testimony, a testimony which gives evidence of a rule of faith which existed for the writers of the ancient Church. This rule of faith was essentially this: unity with the See of Peter was the most certain guarantee available that one was walking in the way of the true faith. End quote. Gasser's other two examples of indirect testimonies are the definitions at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274 AD and in 1439 at the Council of Ferrara, Florence. Gasser also considers these only indirect testimony and not actual examples of papal infallibility, despite arguing the definition from Florence draws directly from the letter of Pope St. Agatho to the Council of Constantinople III, a document Catholic pop apologists erroneously argue claims infallibility. That letter, Gasser believes, does not make the cut for ex cathedra. In short, the man so well versed in theology he was handpicked by the Pope to write the official interpretation of Pastor Aeternus does not think that any of Erick's examples we will encounter in this video, whether the statement from St. Irenaeus, the tome of Pope St. Leo, the LIbellus of Hormisdas, the statements made at Lateran 649 AD, the letter of Agatho to Constantinople III, what Pope Hadrian wrote to the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or any of the classic proof texts argued by Catholic apologists were examples of papal infallibility or even direct testimonies to it. In this sense, Gasser agrees with orthodoxy and modern scholarship. For those who want to know more about Bishop Gasser's Relatio, we recommend watching our video entitled Pope St. Leo's Tome, Proof of Papal Infallibility, as we go over the Relatio extensively.
My job is to present a case for how this definition of primacy is taught in the apostolic tradition. What is the apostolic tradition? For our purposes, we may simply say that apostolic tradition is the faith delivered by the apostles to the church to be guarded and safely transmitted by their successors, the bishops. The contents of apostolic tradition for both Catholics and Orthodox are contained in divine revelation as given in Scripture and tradition. Therefore, if the Vatican Council's definition of papal primacy is sufficiently implied in Scripture and tradition, then this debate's resolution is upheld and demonstrated. Since I am debating an Orthodox Christian, I will be focused mainly on tradition, since in many ways tradition regulates the proper interpretation of the Scripture. Therefore, I will be looking primarily at bishops, church fathers, and holy councils. Nevertheless, Scripture does have three main passages which show forth the basic idea of the Vatican's definition. The first, Matthew 16, 18, and 19. This is the famous passage where Christ is recorded as establishing Peter as the rock and foundation support for the edifice of the church he has built, and gives to him the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which is the power of binding and loosing. A superstructure continually depends on its foundation for stability and strength. Ergo, Peter must have an enduring function in giving said strength to the universal church as long as the church requires its need. Luke 22, 31 and 32. Here, Luke records how Christ singles out Peter to pray for his faith that it may not fail. Once Peter is strengthened by the prayer of Christ, he is to strengthen the faith of his brethren. This signifies a Christo-Petrine dynamic, where Christ fortifies his church through the faith of Peter and serves as a picture utilized by the fathers to describe the Roman See vis-a-vis the universal church. John 21, 15 through 17. Christ gives to Peter the threefold commission to shepherd and pastor the universal flock. This is seen in the command, feed my sheep. To feed sheep is a metaphor for governing the disciples of Christ toward eternal salvation.
Mr. Ybarra fails to mention that the exegesis on these verses singles out the Bishop of Rome just as often as it identifies these verses with the foundation of the episcopate, as Peter was the archetype of all bishops in the patristic mind. It is only with the sinking of the western side of the empire that Rome, in an effort to bolster its relevance, began to invest heavily in the topic of St. Peter being present in Rome and Rome alone. This is demonstrated, repeatedly, in the book The Invention of Peter by George Demacopoulos. Further, on our blog, we have compiled a Florilegium, or list of patristic quotations, demonstrating that the Church Fathers considered all bishops to be Peter, many of them citing the very verses Erick Ybarra uses to support his vision of the papacy. This Florilegium will be linked in the video description below. It should not be denied that the papacy played a significant part in the early Church, and that the East often spoke of Rome in glowing terms. But to prove Pastor Aeternus, one needs more than just glowing terms.
Now for some traditional evidences from the Church's tradition. In the 2nd century, we read from Irenaeus of Lyon that the apostolic tradition, as held by the Roman See, is a universal norm unto which all churches must agree. This means Rome's perspective was at least supremely credible. Contemporary to Irenaeus is Pope Victor, who attempted to enforce the bind of excommunication from the common union of Christ's body upon the churches of Asia. This shows a sense of legal responsibility, i.e., jurisdiction, over all.
The understanding of that text put forward by Mr. Ybarra during the recent debate has 4 issues with it. The text he is alluding to states, quote, "Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness and perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the 2 most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority." End quote. The first issue is the Latin used by St. Irenaeus is not clear. The Latin word convenire almost always means simply to arrive or to convene, and not to agree with. So it would be odd to use the term to mean agree with, especially considering all of the other words in Latin that specifically denote agreement, such as consentiere, adsentior, congruere, or even aboidere, among many others. This is one reason why there has been tremendous debate for the better part of 2 centuries now on what the proper translation even is. The second issue is that the quotation provided comes from the work Against Heresies, and when one reads the following several pages, they will automatically realize the rule of thumb St. Irenaeus sets up is not that one must agree with Rome per se, but that correct dogma is preserved in sees founded by apostles, as any bishopric set up by apostles has the deposit of faith. Shortly, after giving the above quotation, St. Irenaeus writes, quote, "Suppose there arise a dispute relative to some important question among us. Should we not have recourse to the most ancient churches with which the apostles held constant intercourse, and learn from them what is certain and clear in regard to the present question? For how should it be if the apostles themselves had not left us writings? Would it not be necessary, in that case, to follow the course of the tradition which they handed down to those to whom they did commit the churches?" End quote. As the viewer can see, St. Irenaeus simply singles out Rome as the most prominent of these. Quote, "Nor will any one of the rulers in the churches, however highly gifted he may be in point of eloquence, teach doctrines different from these, for no one is greater than the master. Nor, on the other hand, will he who is deficient in power of expression inflict injury on the tradition. For the faith, being ever one and the same, neither does one who is able at great length to discourse regarding it make any addition to it, nor does one who can say but little diminish it." End quote. Notice St. Irenaeus does not state that they cannot change doctrine, but that they will not change doctrine. He can say this because he considers any see established by an apostle to be an infallible see. So, with this in mind, if convenire actually does mean to agree with, St. Irenaeus must have been speaking of churches that do not have an apostolic foundation because, in his mind, apostolic churches could not disagree simply by the fact that they had all received their teachings from the apostles. The third issue, and this is recorded in the Ecclesiastical History of Eusebius, Book 5, chapters 23 and 24, is that this saint openly disagreed with and admonished the Pope when he excommunicated the Quartodecimans, a group who celebrated Easter on the date of Passover. The church historian Eusebius of Caesarea actually records the event, as well as the letter of St. Irenaeus admonishing Pope Victor and other bishops concerning breaking communion with the Quartodecimans. In short, Eusebius states that St. Irenaeus and other bishops admonish Pope Victor and that they, quote, live in peace, end quote, with the Quartodecimans, indicating that St. Irenaeus did not follow the lead of Pope St. Victor. Furthermore, Pope Victor himself is actually following the lead of various synods, not only one in Rome, but also ones in Gaul, the Holy Land, the Black Sea, and Mesopotamia, that were called to discuss the issue. So he is only acting because he feels he is backed by those synods. It should be noted that Eusebius indicates Pope Victor actually did excommunicate the Quartodecimans by letter, quote, thereupon Victor, who presided over the church at Rome, immediately attempted to cut off from the common unity the parishes of all Asia, with the churches that agreed with them as heterodox, and he wrote letters and declared all the brethren there wholly excommunicated. End quote. But then Victor is forced to reverse his decision because he was rebuked by so many bishops, who were led by none other than St. Irenaeus, who writes a long letter regarding the apostolic nature of celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan. So no, St. Irenaeus does not think all churches need to agree with Rome, or else he would have supported the excommunication of those churches celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan, as it did not accord with Roman customs. The fourth issue is that it depends on the idea that only Pope Victor could excommunicate other bishops, or that even if any bishop could excommunicate others, then only Pope Victor could force other bishops to fall in line with the excommunications he issued. Defenders of this view will argue that because no one objected by saying the Pope did not have the right to excommunicate those churches, that it means they accepted the right the Pope could do that. And, believe it or not, those Catholic apologists are correct. No one objected to Pope Victor's right to excommunicate whomever he wanted. But what those apologists fail to mention is there is no indication Pope Victor thought his excommunication was binding on those outside of his own diocese. In fact, despite saying the excommunications were sent out, Eusebius never says that Victor cut them off from the common communion of the church, but that he, quote, attempted to, end quote. Considering Victor already sent the letters of excommunication, he was not simply threatening, but actually notifying them that the communion had already been broken. The reason is because no one thought that his excommunication was binding outside of his diocese. This last piece is very hard for Catholics to accept, because they look back into the past using a Vatican I lens, but if we remove that lens and simply present the history in its bare form, we find that Rome regularly held communion with sees which were still in communion with other sees which had been excommunicated by Rome. The Meletian Schism is a good example of this, because Rome excommunicated St. Meletius of Antioch, but stayed in communion with the three Cappadocians, all of whom were in communion with St. Meletius. We see it again with Acacius of Beroia, after the First Council of Ephesus. He maintained communion with Rome, Ephesus, and Alexandria on the one hand, but on the other hand, he also stayed in communion with Antioch, despite the schism of 431 through 433 AD. We even see it with St. Cyprian of Carthage, who died out of communion with Rome, but was held as a saint by the rest of the church who maintained communion with him. So there is no indication that excommunication was to be upheld by others upon pain of excommunication, but rather that even papal excommunications were considered local. If that is not the case, then the above situations cannot be reconciled with reality. Furthermore, we see that bishops, regardless of where they were, could excommunicate whomever they wanted. St. Cyprian of Carthage, again, being an example, as he and his synod refused communion with Basilides and Martial, two Spanish bishops who had been reinstated by Rome after they had lapsed under persecution. The entire event is recorded in letter 67 of St. Cyprian, and we will discuss it more later. Other examples were during the Fifth Ecumenical Council, when the North African bishops excommunicated Pope Vigilius for doing what they perceived as backtracking on Chalcedon, and the Fifth Council itself suspended Pope Vigilius from office for defending what were obviously Nestorian writings. In short, Pope Victor threatening to excommunicate the Quartodecimans in Asia Minor does not prove universal jurisdiction, because bishops were regularly excommunicating other bishops and groups outside of their territory. We even have a list of occurrences like this in our series on St. Cyril of Alexandria and the Council of Ephesus, found on our blog. But never mind that. Mr. Ybarra cannot let facts get in the way of Vatican I, because his motto might as well be Rome at all costs. Most interesting of all, we even have the example of Pope St. Gelasius, one of those popes whom Erick Ybarra considers some sort of Vatican I prototype. Pope St. Gelasius, in a letter to a certain Faustus, explains how his predecessor, Pope Felix, could excommunicate Patriarch Acacius of Constantinople. It does not support Mr. Ybarra's contention. Pope Gelasius states, quote, "Who says that Acacius could not have been condemned by one person? I am surprised if he does not realize his own ignorance himself. Yes, does he not realize that Acacius was condemned according to the formula of the Synod of Chalcedon? Does he not know, or is he pretending not to know? By that formula particularly, it is agreed that the instigators of Acacius's error were condemned by a majority vote of bishops, just as a clear consideration of events shows to have been done, and is being done, in the case of every single heresy from the beginning of the Christian religion, and that my predecessor was appointed executor of the old ordinance, not the instigator of a new regulation. It is permissible not only for an apostolic leader, but for every pontiff to separate from Catholic communion whomsoever they like and whatever place they like, according to the rule of the very heresy that has previously been condemned." End quote. Gelasius states that any bishop could have excommunicated Acacius or any other heretic because, according to St. Gelasius, Acacius was in violation of previous anathemas. In the case of Pope Victor, numerous councils had decided upon the date of Easter, and Victor was merely enforcing it. But Pope St. Gelasius denies it was something particular to Rome, and in fact, he uses the same term for the condemnation of Acacius by the Pope or by any other bishop. It should be noted that in this same letter, Gelasius also locates Chalcedon's authority not so much in Rome ratifying it, but in its general ratification by the episcopate, reflecting the Orthodox understanding of conciliarity. So we can see from this that Pope Gelasius, Pope whom Mr. Ybarra has claimed is an exemplar of papal thinking, does not share Mr. Ybarra's misunderstanding of history. Instead, Pope St. Gelasius sees Felix III as really doing nothing any other bishop could not also do.
In the 3rd century, Pope Stephen appealed to the Matthean text, situating Peter and his successors as the rock upon which the church is built, in order to legitimize his enforcement of the Roman policy on baptism in North Africa. The 5th century Vincent de Lerins, a saint cherished by both Catholics and Orthodox, corroborates that not only was Stephen correct in policy, but also in authoritative procedure over his interlocutors. That is from the 6th chapter of his Commonitorium.
The comments by Pope St. Stephen are known only via St. Firmilian, and even within that context, it is St. Stephen's boast. It is not so much about Petrine authority, but rather that Stephen has an apostolic throne, and it is therefore rightful when St. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, does not have an apostolic throne and is therefore wrong. This goes back to the point about St. Irenaeus. In the mind of the early patristics, apostolic churches cannot falter, and so Stephen is not emphasizing Peter, but emphasizing that he possesses the authority that comes with an apostolic lineage. This is why, 30 years prior to the tone-deaf policy of Pope Victor at the end of the 2nd century, Pope Anicetus backed down on the topic of the Quartodecimans when confronted with the practice of another apostolic see in the person of St. Polycarp. It should also be noted that St. Stephen's practices were eventually rejected by the Church because even though it was later whitewashed, St. Cyprian, in his 72nd and 73rd epistles, quotes Pope St. Stephen as stating even Marcionites and various other Gnostic sects were not to be received by baptism, but only by laying on of hands, and this was repeatedly rejected by the Church.
Concerning the event with Pope Victor in Asia, the late Orthodox Archbishop and theologian Stylianus Harkianakis states the following, quote, "It was at this point that the differentiation between the Catholic Church of the West and that of the East began," close quote. That's from his Infallibility of the Church in Orthodox Theology, page 146. Orthodox theologian Father Laurent Kleinenwerk, in his book, His Broken Body, states the following, quote, "One could therefore argue that the great schism started with Victor, continued with Stephen, and remained underground until the 9th century," close quote. That's page 155. Clearly, therefore, Victor and Stephen, both saints in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, gave the impression of a primacy of universal jurisdiction.
But here, Mr. Ybarra is misunderstanding the words of these two writers, neither of whom are theologians per the Orthodox understanding of the term. They are not saying that anything even approaching Vatican I was present in the above described events. They are just indicating that a growing intolerance for a plurality of practices, the type of behavior that led to the schism, was beginning to show itself very early on, and that is correct. It was a carryover from pagan Rome that the inhabitants of Rome expected others to act, think, eat, drink, and walk like they did.
In the 4th century, Eastern provincial councils were overturned by the annulments enacted by the authority of the Roman court. The Council of Sardica insisted that such was appropriate, since the Roman see, as the see of Peter, was the head of all bishops in East and West. Athanasius the Great was present and subscribed to its decrees. This clearly shows legal authority of Rome's disciplinary and doctrinal court in light of a continued possession of Peter's primacy.
First, Mr. Ybarra is just straight out lying because he has been corrected on this repeatedly. One of them at minute mark 48 of our first video, which we direct the listener to for a fuller discussion on this topic. In this case, he is referring to, it has been pointed out to him repeatedly, that Rome did not overturn the verdicts, but that the Arian side approached the Pope asking for a mutually agreed upon arbitration between themselves and St. Athanasius, to which the saint agreed. The Arians then did not show up on the agreed upon date, so they forfeited their case, thus automatically restoring St. Athanasius and his friends to their sees. This is not controversial. It is in the actual letter Pope Julius wrote to the Arians, and in the writings of St. Athanasius when he records the event himself. Likewise, Socrates records it as the Council of Sardica itself restoring St. Athanasius and company to their sees. Second, the canons he is referring to, those of the Council of Sardica, do not state that Rome can overturn councils. They simply state that if a cleric is deposed, they may appeal to the Pope, and the Pope will act as a review court, deciding whether or not the case can be heard by an appeals court. The canons then stipulate that the appeals court is not Rome, but rather the province in the territory adjacent to the province of the deposed cleric. The most the Pope can do after that is send a small number of clerics to join the appeals court, no more. Rome is not the appeals court. It is what the U.S. legal system refers to as a review court. This is covered in our first video, and, God willing, we will eventually do a video on the Council of Sardica, its canons, and how the situation with St. Athanasius caused it.
That this primacy was held superior to even councils is clear from the testimony of Pope Innocent I, who wrote the following in 416 AD, quote, "Whatever is done, even if it be in the distant provinces, should not be ended without being brought to the knowledge of this see, that by its authority the whole just pronouncement should be strengthened," close quote.
That is called synodality. We encourage the listeners to view the Apostolic Canon 34, stating that the synodal head has nothing to do without the synod, and the synod has nothing to do without the synodal head, and so on. So no, this does not support his contention. You will notice that Mr. Ybarra seems to read statements like the above to mean that because nothing can be done without the synodal head, therefore, the synodal head can do as he pleases. This is a false understanding of ecclesiology, but it has to be maintained if you are trying to squeeze Vatican I into history. Otherwise, you will just be stuck with repeated examples of synodality.
Clear evidence comes further from the presbyter Philip, who stated at the Council of Ephesus 431, which is ecumenical for both Catholics and Orthodox, that Christ divinely singled out Peter as the rock foundation, bearer of the keys of the kingdom of heaven, head of the apostles, and the whole church, who, quote, "today and forever lives and judges in his successors," close quote. This was read aloud in both Latin and Greek and was inscribed into the official Acts of the Council.
Because Mr. Ybarra has not read the Acts of the Council of Ephesus, he does not realize the words of the presbyter Philip were the beginning of a speech about 4 times the size of the small quotation Mr. Ybarra has provided. This is precisely what happens when one studies patristics purely, or even largely, from quote mines. They do not understand the actual context of what is being said. The full quotation is found on page 378 of Father Richard Price's commentary and translation entitled The Council of Ephesus of 431. In the full speech, Philip the Presbyter, who is in the acting role as the official representative of the Pope, and after explaining that the emperors had called the council, that the 10-day allotment of time provided by Pope St. Celestine had long run out, and that Nestorius had refused to follow the summons, and that the council had excommunicated Nestorius, etc. Philip then ratifies the decision of the council on behalf of Pope St. Celestine. Again, this is simply synodality, nothing more, nothing less, and there is a very good reason Catholic apologists truncate the quotation. The rest of it disallows the interpretation that they desire.
When Emperor Theodosius II convened the Council of Ephesus in 449, Flavian of Constantinople appealed over its court to the throne of Peter in order to annul its decrees. This is perhaps the clearest instance of a saint appealing to the Sardican privilege of Rome in order to check the decrees of an ecumenical council.
Pope St. Leo annulling the robber synod was apparently not enough to dismantle the depositions, because the first session of the Council of Chalcedon proceeded to canonically dismantle Ephesus 449, and then, later on in the council, various depositions carried out by Dioscorus were overturned. In fact, those depositions carried out by Dioscorus are yet another example of a bishop excommunicating those outside of not just his diocese, but also his patriarchate, much like Pope Victor. As a side note, Leo recognized Dioscorus's right to depose and excommunicate bishops outside of his see when Leo almost immediately went into communion with Maximus of Antioch, Dioscorus's hand-picked replacement for the deposed Dominus of Antioch. Per the Sardican canons, all Leo could do was pause the deposition and decide whether or not it could go to a real trial somewhere else. That's it. The pertinent canons are 3, 4, 5, and 9 of Sardica, and the meanings are beyond clear. In addition, Mr. Ybarra, in the debate and later in the debate review, asserts that everyone understood Ephesus II as an ecumenical council. This is patently false, and indicates either that Mr. Ybarra does not know what he is talking about, or is simply being untruthful to Father Patrick and the audience in order to support his neo-papal view that a pope is an entity separate and above an ecumenical council. For one, he is using the term ecumenical council ambiguously. At this time in church history, ecumenical simply referred to the fact that the emperor was bankrolling the event and that its decrees would be signed into law. It did not refer specifically to any actually binding dogmatic council as it does in the Catholic Church today. Furthermore, the legate of the Pope of Rome, Deacon Hilarius, rejected Ephesus II on the spot before leaving the council during a riot. The lawful patriarch of Constantinople, St. Flavian, who was nearly beaten to death at said council, and the See of Antioch under Patriarch Dominus also rejected it, so it did not match the criteria for an ecumenical council as it initially had only the signatures of 2 of the 5 patriarchates. This is important because at the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787 AD at Constantinople, the argument as to why the Iconoclast Council of Hieria, held in 754, was not an ecumenical council was that it was signed neither by Rome, nor Alexandria, nor Antioch, nor Jerusalem. This was not simply a later view, as the historian Socrates, dying in 439 and 10 years prior to Ephesus II, has his famous statement, usually taken entirely out of context, that nothing is to be decided without the Bishop of Rome agreeing to it. If you follow a collegial and conciliar model, you need the Bishop of Rome present just as you need the other patriarchs present. So very early on, the standards were set that, at least within normal circumstances, for example, if the Pope or Patriarch was not a heretic, you had to have the Pope and other patriarchs present and in agreement. This gets into the Roman concept of auctoritas, in which one acts as a gatekeeper, a witness, an affirmer, or ratifier of the acts of others. One with auctoritas could grant or withhold their approval, and in so doing, stop a process from occurring, but could not go out and make something happen on their own initiative. It is similar to a prime minister in a parliamentary system. In the near future, we will do a video on the topic of auctoritas, but in the meantime, we have a short article on our blog entitled On Auctoritas.
In the third session of the Council of Chalcedon, the official sentence of excommunication against Dioscorus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, states that Pope Leo, through the council, quote, together with the thrice blessed and all-glorious Peter the Apostle, who is the rock and foundation of the Catholic Church and the foundation of the Orthodox faith, has stripped Dioscorus of his episcopate, close quote. Clearly, the Matthean text, which invested Peter with a universal primacy of jurisdiction, is here understood to be living and active in the enforced authority of his successor, Leo the Great.
It is ironic that even though Mr. Ybarra points out the deposition came, quote, through the council, end quote, his words, not ours, he still mistakes it for an activity of universal, ordinary, and immediate jurisdiction when it is clearly synodal. It is the same case with Philip the Presbyter at Ephesus. The council votes, then the synodal head casts his vote ratifying the decision, and the case is closed. It is essentially a parliamentary system. The problem here is that Mr. Ybarra has skewed his view of synodality due to spending so much time trying to convince himself it can exist under an autocratic universal bishop. This becomes exceptionally clear in the debate review when Mr. Ybarra repeats the analogy from the Catholic Encyclopedia about each military officer having full and immediate jurisdiction over the troops under him, but the higher officers are able to override the lower officers. Erick then claims this does not result in each diocese having 2 ordinary bishops, but it does, because Father Patrick immediately asks whether a priest is to obey his local bishop or the Pope if the 2 give conflicting orders. Erick is caught off guard by this, and then stumbles through an attempted answer, ending it by essentially saying he can't say why, and then blames it on lack of time. The reality is, in the Catholic system, there really is only one ordinary bishop for each diocese, the Pope, and all other bishops are simply his auxiliaries within what would seem like their own diocese.
In Sermon 51, Leo states that of all things which are petitioned in the church, quote, only that should be ratified in heaven, which had been settled by the judgment of Peter, close quote, i.e., Rome's judgment. This is why Leo felt qualified to annul the 28th canon of Chalcedon, quote, by the authority of St. Peter, close quote. That's from letter 105. Though there are many pastors and bishops in the universal church, says Leo in letter 14, quote, all should converge toward Peter's one seat, and no one anywhere should be separated from its head, close quote, i.e., the Apostolic See of Rome.
The topic of Canon 28 of Chalcedon comes up often, and Leo would have been qualified to annul it had Rome not already accepted the third canon of Constantinople, which is what the 28th canon of Chalcedon repeats. In fact, we know Rome accepted it because of what the head papal legate, Pascasinus, points out in this exchange in the Acts of Chalcedon. Quote, during the reading, the most devout Oriental bishops and those with them exclaimed, Flavian went in as if already condemned. There is a blatant case of corrupt prosecution. Why was Flavian not seated in his proper place? Why was the Bishop of Constantinople put in 5th place? Pascasinus, the most devout bishop, said, look, in accordance with the will of God, we give first place to the Lord Anatolius, but they put the blessed Flavian 5th. Diogenes, the most devout bishop of the church of Cyzicus, said, because you know the canons, end quote. There is only one canon that Bishop Pascasinus could have referred to, and that is the third canon of Constantinople I, which states that Constantinople, being New Rome, ranks after Rome. As for why the Eastern bishops, namely Anatolius, agrees to withdraw it, he sees Leo as being unreasonable and realizes a more prudent path is to just continue doing what they had always been doing since 381. This is why Canon 28 never died. The East realized the West had accepted it and then tried to renege on it.
In the 6th century, a 30-year schism between Rome and the Eastern churches was healed by a universal subscription to a formula put down by Pope Hormisdas in 519. In that formula, it was clearly enunciated that the divine promise of our Lord to protect his church was through the instrumentality of preserving Peter's faith in the teaching ministry of the Apostolic See of Rome, which is the rock and solidity of the whole Christian religion. Countless bishops of both East and West signed this formula and returned into full communion with the church. Concerning this formula, the late and great Orthodox theologian Father Alexander Schmemann, who was a historian in his own right, states, quote, characteristic of this eternal compromise with Rome was the signing of the formula of Hormisdas by the Eastern bishops in 519, ending the 30-year schism between Rome and Constantinople. The whole essence of the papal claims cannot be more clearly expressed than in this document, which was imposed upon the Eastern bishops, close quote. That's from The Historical Road of Eastern Orthodoxy, page 240.
Except only the Patriarchate of Constantinople signed it. The other patriarchates wrote their own professions of faith, and if one reads the letter of Pope St. Hormisdas to Patriarch Epiphanios of Constantinople, he gives the requirements for the contents of those professions, and never once does anything about Rome or Peter come up. In fact, from the surviving libelli we have, Peter is rarely, if ever, mentioned. Further, the libellus only lends itself to an understanding of Vatican I if you are reading it with the definitions and baggage of those terms dictated by Vatican I.
At the Council of Lateran 649, the Eastern Bishop Stephen of Dor, a unique disciple of Sophronius of Jerusalem, described how he and Sophronius were of the mind that in order to squelch the monothelite heresy in the East, they must appeal to the Roman See, quote, that rules and presides over all others. I mean, your sovereign and supreme see. It has been accustomed to perform this authoritatively from the first and from of old, on the basis of its apostolic and canonical authority, for the reason, evidently, that the true great Peter, the head of the apostles, was deemed worthy not only to be entrusted alone out of all with the keys of the kingdom of heaven, but also because he was the first to be entrusted with shepherding the sheep of the whole Catholic Church. As the text runs, Peter, do you love me? shepherd my sheep. And again, because he possessed more than all others, in an exceptional and unique way, firm and unshakable faith in our Lord, he was deemed worthy to turn and strengthen his comrades and spiritual brethren when they were wavering, since providentially he had been adorned by the God who became incarnate for our sakes, with power and priestly authority over them all. Close quote. That's Richard Price, The Acts of the Lateran Council, page 143. Here, there is an unmistakable usage of the three most famous Petrine texts of the New Testament to prove the supremacy and fallibility of the Roman pontiff.
First, terms like rule, preside, and supreme do not qualify the extent and prerogatives or content of said rule and presidency. For example, patriarchs or metropolitans are said to preside over their synods. Likewise, they are the highest or supreme leader within such a synod. Only the most clueless doubt that Rome held the highest position in the first millennium church, so arguing for that point is attacking a straw man. Second, Stephen's letter is in Greek, and as we see later on in the quotation, he is drawing a parallel between the words of Christ to Peter in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 16, and the role of Pope Martin. This means Stephen's original Greek used the verb poimano, which, though occasionally translated as rule, actually tends towards the meaning tend or shepherd. But even in that case, terms like shepherd or rule or preside and supreme have to be radically repurposed and redefined to entail the type of infallible autocracy Vatican I accorded to the Roman pontiff. What is interesting to note is how Stephen seemingly departs from the typical patristic exegesis of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, and the Gospel of Matthew chapter 18, verse 18, when he implies that the keys were not given to the other apostles, but only to Peter. Then again, if you recall that in the patristic mind, Peter is the archetype of all bishops, it makes sense why he says this. This is exceptional considering that until the scholastics, the power of the keys in Roman Catholic theology was simply the power to forgive sins. In contravention to Vatican I's Pastor Aeternus, he states Rome's capabilities are based on both its apostolic and canonical situation, while Pastor Aeternus specifically denies the canons or councils have given anything to Rome. Third, what Mr. Ybarra leaves out is the translator of the Acts of Lateran that he is quoting from. The Catholic priest and patristic scholar, Father Richard Price, does not agree with the historical revisionism of Mr. Ybarra. In fact, concerning the very quotation Mr. Ybarra just brought up, Father Price writes, quote, "This expresses the papalist theory that St. Peter had unique authority among the apostles and that his role was fully and uniquely inherited by the popes of Rome. This theory was accepted in the East to the extent that it recognized that the popes had a special responsibility to stand up for the truth, but not in the sense that they were believed to possess a charism of truth in virtue of which their rulings were to be accepted without question or examination." End quote. In fact, in the introduction, had Mr. Ybarra actually read it, Father Price lays it out in writing, quote, "The involvement of successive popes in the controversy reflected the position of the Roman Church as leader of the universal church and the special prestige of Rome in matters of doctrine articulated in ideas of papal primacy. Peter's confession of faith at Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19, was the basis for the idea that the popes had a special authority in matters of doctrine and teaching because they had gained their understanding through St. Peter directly from Christ. This primatial position was acknowledged throughout the Eastern and Western churches. However, this did not mean that in the East, papal pronouncements on matters of doctrine were regarded as automatically definitive and necessitating acceptance." End quote. But again, if, like Mr. Ybarra, your lens is Rome at all costs, nothing should get in the way of the narrative, especially not the truth.
Maximus the Confessor was both present and subscribed to all the utterances in this council. Maximus, too, however, unambiguously held that the Roman see held, quote, supreme dominion, authority, and power over all of God's churches throughout the whole world to bind and loose, close quote. Opscula 12, translation from Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev in his book, Orthodox Christianity, Volume 1, page 110.
Mr. Ybarra, true to himself, truncates the quotation in order to hide the context. Here is the rest of the quotation. Quote, instead of satisfying or entreating the blessed Pope of the most holy Catholic Church of Rome, that is, the Apostolic Throne, which is from the incarnate Son himself, and which, in accordance with the holy canons and the definitions of faith received from all the holy councils, universal and supreme dominion, authority, and power of binding and loosing over all the holy churches of God, which are in the whole world. Notice the full quotation states it is from canons and definitions of faith, and that goes against Vatican I, which specifically denies Rome has received anything from an ecumenical council, but instead that it was all given immediately and directly by Christ to St. Peter. But St. Maximus is saying something different. He is saying that the apostolic throne is from the incarnate Son of God himself, while the prerogatives are given canonically. But what about the phrase, quote, universal and supreme dominion, authority, and power of binding and loosing over all the holy churches of God, which are in the whole world, end quote. First, supreme simply means highest, while Mr. Ybarra is trying to argue it means something along the lines of absolute. St. Maximus is referring to the fact that the Pope, as Archbishop of the world, has the position in normal circumstances, in other words, the Pope is not a heretic, of confirming the acts of ecumenical councils as he was the synodal head, just as Constantinople is now. That is just a part of synodality, nothing special, as when the Pope is able to reopen the cases of deposed clerics when appealed to and send them to retrial per the canons of Sardica. Aside from those canons, there are no other canons St. Maximus could possibly be referring to. If there are, please inform us and we will gladly stand corrected. The terms Mr. Ybarra would need to provide to prove his argument are ones like absolute, complete, total, and without the consent of the Church. But we do not find those terms in the first millennium applied to papal jurisdiction. Where we do find them is in 1871 in Pastor Aeternus, a council that proposed something so radically new it had to use terms not used in the first millennium to express it.
In the 7th century, Pope Martin delegated his patrine authority to John, a bishop of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, to clean up church offices that were seized by heretics in the East. The Pope states that John must, quote, correct the things which are wanting and appoint bishops, presbyters, and deacons in every city of those which are subject to the see, both of Jerusalem and of Antioch. We charge you to do this in every way, in virtue of the apostolic authority which was given us by the Lord in the person of the most holy Peter, Prince of the Apostles, on account of the necessities of our time and the pressure of the nations, close quote. That's Mansi 10, 806, translation from Thomas William Allies, The See of Peter, page 120. Very clear testimony to jurisdiction being exerted in the East by virtue of the investments given to Peter immediately by Christ by a martyr pope highly venerated by the Orthodox Church.
For one, the Latin does not say, we charge you, but we exhort you. So he is not ordering Bishop John to do it, but essentially pleading with him. We also never actually hear what happens with Bishop John because, aside from this one letter, he is unknown to history, and there is no indication he even listened to the exhortation. Having said that, this would lend itself more so to Mr. Ybarra's argument if the hierarchy in the area were actually Orthodox when Pope St. Martin did this, but they were not. They had largely gone heretical. At this point in time, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem was vacant, and the Patriarch of Antioch was in hiding in Constantinople. So it was really a Wild West type of situation in which no one was really in charge, and that is why the actions of Pope St. Martin trying to set up an Orthodox hierarchy in heretical lands is no different than the current practice of Orthodox synods establishing hierarchies of Orthodox bishops in Roman Catholic or Protestant lands. It is no different and is built upon the same principle Popes Theodore and Martin were operating on, restoring Orthodox clergy to an area embroiled in heresy. Case in point, we have no problem installing a bishop in New York, despite the fact Catholic, Anglican, and Lutheran bishops reside there because we consider them persona non grata, and an Orthodox bishop is established to care for the Orthodox Christians residing there. For more information on this, we would again recommend the article we wrote entitled, Does Lateran 649 Prove Papal Infallibility?
At the Council of Constantinople 681, Pope Agatho's letter was approved by the Greeks as the voice of Peter. In that letter, Agatho stated that the Roman Church, quote, had never turned away from the path of truth in any direction of error, whose authority, that as that of the Prince of the Apostles, the whole Catholic Church and the ecumenical synods have faithfully embraced and followed in all things, close quote. He goes on to say that the teaching of Rome, quote, remains undefiled unto the end, according to the divine promise of the Lord and Savior himself, close quote. And then cites Christ's promise to Peter in Luke 22:31-32. The late Protestant historian Philip Schaff wrote, quote, Agatho quotes the words of Christ to Peter in favor of papal infallibility, anticipating, as it were, the Vatican decision of 1870, close quote.
Sounds impressive, until we read the Acts of the Sixth Council. What Mr. Ybarra conveniently leaves out is that the letter in which these claims are made is repeatedly and consistently described as, quote, a suggestion by the very papal legates, the emperor, and the council fathers. That's right, a suggestion submitted to the council. Further, the letter of St. Agatho is not referred to as dogmatic or doctrinal until after the council has ratified it. Even further, in the letter the council writes to the Pope stating that their own doctrinal statement, which they were sending to him to ratify, was, quote, infallible. Here is the full quotation. Quote, and we all agree both in heart and tongue and hand, and have put forth, by the assistance of the life-giving Spirit, a definition, clean from all error, certain and infallible, not removing the ancient landmarks, as it is written, God forbid, but remaining steadfast in the testimonies and authority of the holy and approved fathers. End quote. Let us not forget that the Church Fathers saw the empire as divinely established. In fact, following St. Paul, they saw all governments as divinely established, for good or for bad. And so it should come as no surprise when Pope St. Agatho told the emperor that the emperor spoke ex cathedra. He states, quote, for these decrees the Holy Spirit by his grace dictated to the tongue of the imperial pen. End quote. So following Mr. Ybarra's proof-texting ways, we have to admit that we have a divinely established institution, that is the empire, and that God can speak infallibly through its head, the emperor. So the emperor can speak ex cathedra, right? Of course not. But this shows the level of flattery. One would think it was purely brown-nosing were it not part of the etiquette of the time. But back to the idea of Pope St. Agatho's letter to the council as merely a suggestion. Imagine that. Pope Francis, after drinks with Pachamama and company, issues his ex cathedra statement, De Missa Scororum, or On the Clown Mass, which mandates that all priests must dress as Bozo the Clown to celebrate the mysteries. But the bishops, after receiving it solemnly, but dressed as bishops, not as clowns, referred to it as a suggestion and do not receive it as a binding dogmatic statement. It would almost be as if De Missa Scororum was not even an encyclical, let alone ex cathedra, but was merely a suggestion submitted to the council for its approval. One might argue that the letter of Pope St. Agatho was not ex cathedra. In fact, they might try to say that it was not even an encyclical, which, of course, would also demand assent, but one might try to argue that when the council ratified the statements within it concerning Rome's spotless past and ability to speak infallibly, these teachings were accepted as de fide by the council. But if that were the case, why was the council's next act to condemn a pope for heresy if they had just accepted a document they had interpreted to mean Rome could not fail on a doctrinal level? Even if we accept Honorius was not speaking on faith and morals in a manner desiring to bind the entire church, was Pope St. Agatho really ignorant of Pope St. Liberius, who succumbed and signed an Arian profession of faith, or Pope Felix the Arian, both in the 4th century? Was he unaware of Pope Vigilius, who had to be suspended from office by the 5th Ecumenical Council for defending blatantly Nestorian writings in the 6th century? Did Pope Agatho truly not know what had transpired under Pope St. Vitalian, in which Rome had maintained communion with the Monothelites and abandoned St. Maximus the Confessor to death in the 7th century? Can we honestly say Pope St. Agatho was unaware Honorius, who, whether speaking infallibly or not, told Sergius that monoenergism was an acceptable theological opinion? The answer is Pope St. Agatho knew about all of these and ignored them. He was not being literal, nor were the bishops present taking him literally. In fact, we find similar statements from popes and councils. Exhibit A, the letter of Pope St. Celestine to the clergy of Constantinople. Quote, "For, as you know, up till now you have had priests powerful in teaching and holiness, who never departed from the traditions of the fathers and directed the Church of God in utter tranquility." End quote. Did St. Celestine really think the See of Constantinople had been free of heretics up until Nestorius? What about when the Council of Chalcedon, in its official letter to Leo asking him to approve Canon 28, stated, quote, "And the See of Constantinople will receive its recompense for having always shown you great ardor in the cause of piety, and for having zealously allied itself with you for the sake of harmony." End quote. But the See of Constantinople actually had not always shown itself allied to Rome. Even if we count only Pope Leo's reign, which this seems to be referring to, Rome and Constantinople had been in schism from the time of the robber synod of Ephesus II until shortly before the Council of Chalcedon. So why did they say always? The reason is they expected the reader to gloss over embarrassments and take it as a general rule. It is the same with Pope St. Agatho's letter. He was not ignorant, nor was he lying. He was simply speaking in generalities that do not translate from culture to culture.
Lastly, in the 8th century, Pope Hadrian I sent dogmatic letters to be read aloud at the Council of Nicaea, in which he states, quote, "For the blessed Peter himself, the chief of the apostles, who first sat in the apostolic see, left the chiefship of his apostolate and pastoral care to his successors, who are to sit in his most holy seat forever," close quote. This was also read aloud in both Greek and Latin and inscribed into the official Acts of Nicaea II, Session 2. According to Orthodox theologian Father Laurent Kleinenwerk concerning Hadrian's letter, the Eastern bishops gave, quote, "total recognition that the Pope of Rome held Peter's see and that Rome was in a unique way heir to Christ's promises to Peter," close quote. His Broken Body, page 200.
There are 3 issues here. First, rather than consult Father Kleinwerk on what Pope Hadrian means, it would be better to consult the actual Acts as well as the scholar who not only translated them, but wrote the commentary on them, Father Richard Price, a Catholic priest and patristic scholar. Second, in his introduction to Session 2 in his translation and commentary on the Acts of Nicaea II, Father Price points out that the same letter of Pope Hadrian Mr. Ybarra is quoting from also demands the Byzantine emperor return properties in southern Italy and Sicily to the papacy, demands the ecumenical patriarch returns jurisdiction of the entire Balkans, Greece, Sicily, and Calabria to the pope, demands that the patriarch of Constantinople desist from using the title ecumenical patriarch, and finally, this letter reprimands Saint Taurasios for being elevated from the lay state to the patriarch. The council, which Mr. Ybarra claims accepted Vatican I ecclesiology, simply ignores all of those demands. Notice also that Hadrian does not threaten to break communion over it. Third, and most importantly, in this very same letter to the council, Pope Hadrian tells us exactly how Roman primacy is acted out, and it is not what Mr. Ybarra claims it is. Hadrian states, quote, Peter's see, which exercises primacy throughout the world, was set up as the head of all the churches of God, and has always held and retains the primacy which the blessed Peter the Apostle exercises through an injunction of the Lord's, and with the church no less asserting, to the effect that no see in the whole church ought to have a greater executive role than the first, which confirms each synod by its authority and protects it by its continuing guidance. End quote. The listener will recall what was stated earlier about the concept of auctoritas, and how, though it is typically translated as authority, it is a multifaceted work meaning ratification, witness, clout, or prestige. And we see this in the above quotation when Pope Hadrian states that Rome, quote, confirms each synod by its authority. Moreover, Pope Hadrian states that the effect of the primacy is exactly that, confirmation of synods. As the synodal head, the Pope's job was to ratify the decision of the synod, just like Canon 34 of the Apostolic Canons directs. This is so far from being an example of a Vatican I style papacy. Pope Hadrian is simply stating that the primacy of Rome culminates, or rather, that its greatest capability resides in ratifying the decision of the synod to which it is head. This ties in with the concept of the Pope as the, quote, Archbishop of the world, end quote, as was discussed in the first 40 minutes of our first video. As a side note, the last demand Pope Hadrian makes, that is, complaining about St. Taurasios being elevated from the lay state, was particularly tone-deaf, and the Byzantines had no plans of following Hadrian in this regard, as two later sainted patriarchs, St. Photius the Great and St. Nikephoros, were likewise elevated from the lay state. Both times, Rome protested, and both times, the East never felt as though by ignoring the demands of Rome in this regard, they were somehow in violation of church law.
By way of conclusion, I want to continue quoting Father Laurent Kleinenwerk. He says, quote, since the time of Stephen, 250 AD, the Roman Church has consistently taught that her bishop is the successor of Peter in a unique sense, and that he holds by divine right a primacy of power over the universal church. This was expressed consistently and unambiguously by a number of popes commemorated as saints in the Orthodox Church, including such luminaries as Agatho and Hadrian. As we have seen, this ecclesiology was accepted by a number of Eastern saints, close quote. Moreover, Father Kleinenwerk states that, quote, St. Maximus the Confessor and St. Theodore the Studite expressed the view that Rome was the unique chair of Peter that would not fall into heresy, close quote. His Broken Body, page 213, for both of those quotes just cited.
However true that claim about St. Maximus the Confessor could have been within his life, that was certainly not the belief he held at the end of his life, and we detail that in our series on St. Maximus the Confessor on our blog. Furthermore, when you read the writings of St. Theodore the Studite, he never once justifies the legitimacy of iconography on claims of Rome being unassailable, but instead, he bases it on the Church's liturgy, its prayers, the lives of the saints, etc. It is odd that for someone who supposedly thought Rome could not fall, he wrote volumes and volumes justifying the usage of icons in the Church's tradition, when all he would have had to do was point to an infallible decree from Rome or the tradition of the Church in Rome. Strange. It's almost like he didn't think Rome was infallible. According to Father Christian Capus, a Catholic priest and patristic scholar, St. Theodore actually used sacred mathematics to show the majority of the Pentarchy would always stay Orthodox.
Again, Father Alexander Schmemann states, quote, the theory of the power, potestas, of the Roman primate was openly proclaimed in Rome in the era of the ecumenical councils. But the East, without ever really accepting it, until the 9th century, never once expressed its non-acceptance or rejection of it in any clear way. When Catholic scholars now assert, on the basis of the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon, that the East recognized the primacy of Rome at that time, but then later rejected it, it is rather difficult to answer the charge on the basis of formal historical evidence, since one may in fact conclude from the history of those two councils that the Greek bishops admitted special prerogatives to the Roman bishop. Close quote. That's Historical Road of Eastern Orthodoxy, page 240.
We would be interested to see if and where Rome ever did use the term potestas to refer to its jurisdiction outside of its patriarchate. That I am aware of, it used the term auctoritas, which, as has been previously mentioned, referred to clout, prestige, and witness. It was also used to refer to the right of a guardian to ratify the decisions of their wards, the right of the Senate to appoint consuls. The consuls could then make binding decisions using their potestas. Auctoritas could also refer to a deed of ownership. But what separated auctoritas from potestas was potestas carried a sense of proactive juridical power, while auctoritas referred to a more passive ratifying power. The difference could be summed up in this way. Auctoritas made one more of a gatekeeper who could close or open the gate to those whom they wished. Contrast that with potestas, which made one able to command others to go in and out of the gate. This will play a role later on in this video when we discuss the letter of Pope Hadrian I to the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Mr. Ybarra has repeatedly stated he does not recognize the difference between these two terms, but has also repeatedly denied he needs to cite either modern experts or the Roman jurists themselves. This is particularly important because the terms are meticulously well defined by the Roman jurists because they used the terms throughout their legal codices that found their way into the law code of Justinian in the mid-6th century, and then various adaptations of that in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries that were part of the Roman legal code until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But this is the type of Dunning-Kruger effect Mr. Ybarra marinates in. He thinks that skimming quote mines entitles him to have opinions on the same level of validity as the Roman legal experts and scholars in Latin when it comes to understanding legal terms in a language he does not know. But back to auctoritas and potestas. The terms retain their distinction even in church usage. We know this because in Pastor Aeternus, the term auctoritas is used to speak of Rome throughout the document, except during the sections declaring universal, immediate, and ordinary jurisdiction and the power of infallibility. At that point, the document suddenly switches to using potestas. This is not a coincidence. It is written that way because the Pope's Latinists knew the difference between the terms.
From the statements adduced by saints and holy councils, many of which are recorded in the texts of the highest-ranking books by both Catholic and Orthodox standards, it is sufficiently implied that the Church of the first millennium believed that Christ set Peter over the universal Church with a primacy of jurisdiction as the supreme judge of all the faithful and capable of issuing infallible doctrine that cannot be challenged by any human power. The definition of Vatican I, therefore, is well within the bloodstream of apostolic tradition.
With that, Mr. Ybarra ends his introductory remarks, and Father Patrick begins his opening statement. Father Patrick gave a very good opening statement, and being as we agreed with Fradd's audience that Father Patrick won the debate, there is no need to review what he said. After Father Patrick finished his opening statement, Erick nervously stumbles through his first rebuttal.
So, one of the things I'd like to say here in my rebuttal is simply that the Vatican Council, as I said, had four parts: the institution of the primacy, the permanence of the primacy, the nature of the primacy, and the infallible prerogative of that primacy. And I quoted from a number of instances in the early church where it's clearly delineated that Christ, while he was in the flesh, singled out Peter and equipped or invested him with a primacy of jurisdiction, and that this was not given through any intermediation. It wasn't given through a council's decrees, as Pope Damasus I says in 382. It wasn't regulated by, at least in terms of giving the Bishop of Rome the authority from scratch, by any of the canons. The permanence of the primacy, a number of witnesses in the ecumenical councils, like the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and the Fourth Ecumenical Council.
One of the biggest issues here is the level of Peter syndrome present in Mr. Ybarra's speech. He assumes primacy of jurisdiction simply means Vatican I, when in reality, primacy simply means being the first in a line of equals. So as Orthodox Christians, we understand primacy of jurisdiction to mean the type of appellate jurisdiction given to the Pope at the Council of Sardica in 343 AD. Likewise, we believe the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople has a primacy of jurisdiction per Canons 9 and 17 of Chalcedon, stating he can hear appeals from other patriarchates. Further, of the two figures whom Mr. Ybarra quotes earlier, both Stephen of Dore and St. Maximus the Confessor, both of them explicitly state the canons contributed to Rome's primacy. So at best, Mr. Ybarra can argue that there is a divine primacy without teeth, but that the privileges themselves are granted by canons.
All of those give information that speak to the permanence of the primacy of Rome in the See of Rome only. It's implied that the non-transferability is implied by the divine institution. I take divine institution to imply divine irreversibility. And because the primacy of Rome was divinely instituted and fixed with the life of St. Peter, transferability to another see would require a fresh divine institution. And so I think transferability is ruled out.
From the time of St. Paul, the Church has considered governments to be divine institutions too. The episcopate, presbytery, and diaconate are also divine institutions, as are slave-master relationships. They are all established by divine law in the Scriptures. Furthermore, many church fathers saw the Christian Roman Empire as the divine institution par excellence, which led some to believe its capital, Constantinople, could never fall. In the very wording of the Third Canon of Constantinople I and the 28th Canon of Chalcedon, the logic is that Rome has primacy because of its secular status. So those framers of those particular canons, as well as those who followed them, considered a level of transferability. Once again, Mr. Ybarra assumes a term like divine institution is just automatically synonymous with infallible autocrat.
The other part of the Vatican Council was the nature of the primacy, the jurisdiction. I quoted from Pope Saint Martin, who delegated John, Bishop of Philadelphia, who was delegated by Pope Martin to go into the sees of Antioch and Jerusalem and to replace some of the church offices that were seized. And this is for the offices of bishop, presbyter, and deacon. And then he appeals to the authority that was given to St. Peter by the person of Christ. So it's an immediate and direct, non-intermediatory authority that Pope Martin claimed. And Pope Martin is a highly venerated saint in the Orthodox Church. He is a martyr, and I think his voice needs to be reckoned with, because it also goes along with a chorus of other saints, as Father Lauren Kleinenwerk made clear. Many saints, especially in the West, many of those being popes, and then also Eastern saints, spoke about this singular prerogative of the Roman See that doesn't come from canons, but it came from Christ the Lord to St. Peter.
This is the second of 3 times that Mr. Ybarra brings up Lateran 649 to support his argument, and we will hold off on commenting on it because he expands on this point further during the cross-examination.
The other part of the Vatican Council was the infallible prerogative of St. Peter and his successor. I brought out that this was stated by Pope Agatho in the Sixth Ecumenical Council. It was accepted by the Greeks with no contest, no disagreement. Father Alexander Schmemann recognized that the council did not make any clear rejection of that. And so it's officially inscribed in the highest ranking books for the Orthodox Church, one of the ecumenical councils. Father Alexander Schmemann also recognized that the subscription to the Formula of Hormisdas was basically the whole essence of the papacy in that claim, in that formula. And it was signed by numerous people in the East and the West to heal the Ocasian Schism. So I think that the Vatican Council's decrees, if we could find a bare minimum, would be that Christ singled out Peter to have a primacy of authority. 2, that primacy continues to live on in his successors in the Roman bishopric. 3, that primacy is universal and has jurisdiction. 4, it's divinely instituted and therefore is divinely irreversible and would last until the end of time. I think that no other ecclesiology today, whether we're talking about the Coptic Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox, really has room in its bloodstream to welcome that kind of ecclesiology without severe modifications. And so it leaves, I believe, the Roman Catholic Church, as the only legitimate continuation of this Petrine configuration, which has so many voices from saints and martyrs in the first millennium.
We have already addressed the claims about Pope St. Agatho and Pope St. Hormisdas in the first part of this video, so they need not be rehashed. What does need to be addressed are Mr. Ybarra's statements on ecclesiology. What Mr. Ybarra is trying to say is that the bare minimum of Vatican I is the early practice, and he does not see how that could fit with anyone else's ecclesiology. Now, he is right that Vatican I is incompatible with any ecclesiology save for the Catholic churches. He is completely correct on that, but he is essentially trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, because the starting point should not be Vatican I, but history itself, church history. And considering the admissions by the Pope's hand-picked representatives and scholars at Ravenna and Chieti, the Catholic hierarchy no longer believes Pastor Aeternus and Satis Cognitum accurately represent church history. In fact, linked in the video description below is the Chieti document, and it is worth a read, specifically paragraphs 15 through 20, in which the Pope's hand-picked scholars sell out on the official position of the Catholic Church. It is at this point that Mr. Ybarra brings in his second rebuttal.
So the first thing I would say is that, responding to this idea that universal authority removes the authority of others, like St. Gregory the Great said, St. Gregory the Great is teaching that if there is one bishop of the globe, then everyone else there can't be another bishop. That seems logically required. But that's not what Gregory still taught, that all the churches were subject to the Apostolic See according to the principle of dispute. So whenever he's famous for saying this, when all things are at peace, everyone is an equal. Every bishop is an equal brother. But whenever there is a dispute that arises, there is not a single church under the sun that is not subject to the Apostolic See.
The very event Mr. Ybarra is referencing to demonstrate his point actually demonstrates the opposite. The way in which the discord itself was handled proved it never occurred to the bishops involved that they were at Rome's beck and call in matters such as this. In fact, what the controversy actually showed was that St. Gregory could really only protest because he realized breaking communion would be too far over the line after he found himself all alone, as the other patriarchates he contacted did not think much of it.
The other thing I wanted to say was that, the Council of Sardica set up an appellate jurisdiction of Rome, which makes perfect sense, because even as late as 1931, Pope Pius IX in Quadragesimo Anno stated that the principle of subsidiarity is vital to any philosophy of government, and including the church, which is why Rome always stood by the idea of a chain of appeals before coming to the court of Rome, the last court. Trying to make it a matter of first instance is not, it was not permitted. And even at the Council of Trent, appeals of first instance weren't allowed in Rome. And that's well after the Greek and Latin schism.
Mr. Ybarra would be offering a valid point here, only if we were insisting on a zero-sum equation of either papal autocracy or appellate jurisdiction. But that is not our argument, and we go into some detail on this in our very first video from the 48-minute mark to about 1 hour and 8-minute mark. Our argument is that the situations he is setting up as examples of papal autocracy are actually explained by the system of appellate jurisdiction. So instead of being examples of Vatican I, they are just examples of a review court set up by a synod.
The other thing I wanted to say was, Father mentioned that the Council of Sardica was within the Patriarchate of Rome. However, in the 5th century, in 451, Saint Flavian of Constantinople, who's a saint in both of our rituals, he appealed to Rome over the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus 449. I say ecumenical because, for all intents and purposes, it was ecumenical from its convocation. Flavian appealed to Pope Leo, and Leo interpreted that as, in his letter 44 in letter 44 in the Leonine Epistolary, he refers to Flavian's appeal as an application of the canons of Sardica. And so we already have in 450 an appeal from an Eastern saint in Constantinople, no less, over an ecumenical council to St. Leo, and St. Leo registers that as the Sardican privilege, which means that it's got to be wider than the Roman Patriarchate. What could possibly have foisted a confusion on this matter between Rome and Constantinople in such a short amount of time?
On this point, Mr. Ybarra is actually correct. The Sardican privilege was accepted early on in the East, and there is no indication it was something limited to the East. Where he is wrong here is that he assumes they were the appeals court when really they were simply a review court that sent cases to appeals.
The other thing is St. Cyprian of Carthage. Yes, he did sustain the absolute equality of all bishops, but many scholars and historians recognize that he was superseded by a larger voice in the church. Other saints and other bishops and fathers have superseded his position. In Leo the Great in himself taught that the metropolitan had authority over the bishops in a certain sense. There's no sign of metropolitical structure in Saint Cyprian. But even Orthodox theologian Father Afanasiev, Nicholas Afanasiev, in Primacy of Peter, page 99, edited by John Mindorf, recognizes that Cyprian's logic really needed a universal primate, and he admits that Pope Stephen made the conclusion correctly.
Okay. It is not responsible to say there is no such thing as a metropolitical structure in St. Cyprian, specifically because St. Cyprian of Carthage held the metropolitan see of his own region and actually calls his suffragan bishops together at the Council of Carthage in 257 AD.
Father Patrick, you had said that if the Vatican Council's decree on papal primacy was true, that we would see obedience to Rome all over the place. The fact that there are times where there are people in the church who disobeyed the decrees of Rome disproves, or at least shows that it's unlikely that the Vatican Council's decrees are true. My question to you would be, does Orthodox ecclesiology have unanimous acceptance by everyone, with only minor exceptions in the first millennium.
Can you put context of unanimous section in what context? Are we talking about
Well,
synodal decisions, ecumenical councils, and every little point of life?
Yeah. So basically in it was, I think some sort of criteria was produced, which said that because Rome had been disobeyed in certain instances in the first millennium, that would call into question the truth of the Vatican Council's decrees, because if the Vatican Council was true, then everyone would be obeying Rome, at least the majority, or the virtual unanimous position would be that Rome would have to be obeyed all the time. So I'm curious, though, does Orthodox ecclesiology, the belief that you outlined about the metropolitan authority and the bishop's authority being complete in itself, does that have the same kind of universal acceptance? And if not, does Orthodox ecclesiology become falsified?
The easy answer to this is no, because the Church Fathers held to the same canons that lay out our ecclesiology and are the official position of the Church on these issues. The point Father Patrick had made, that goes about a kilometer over Mr. Ybarra's oversized head, is that if absolute obedience to Rome had been an article of faith, the popes were grossly negligent in enforcing this via excommunication. In the debate review, Erick brings this up again, claiming that this argument is analogous to saying the ecumenical councils are invalid simply because some groups did not accept them. That would be a great point, except that the ecumenical councils pronounced anathema on those who rejected their rulings, while the most Rome could do in the above-mentioned cases was pout and perhaps break communion, but could not force others to do so.
Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, in his commentary on the 9th canon of the Council of Chalcedon, goes on to say that, I don't want to quote the whole thing here, but Nicodemus states that the Bishop of Constantinople cannot hear the appeals of metropolitans or bishops who want to appeal above their metropolitans, and that it was restricted to the territories underneath Constantinople.
We actually answered this in our first video in May 2020 and showed St. Nicodemus's interpretation is not only idiosyncratic, but not historically accurate. Even figures such as St. Photius the Great and other great canonists, Zonaras, Blastares, Balsamon, etc., took the view Constantinople could hear appeals from anywhere.
Okay. Well, Erick, do we have much evidence or any evidence of the Bishop of Rome going into another diocese and ordaining presbyters, subdeacons, deacons, as claimed as proper by the Dictatus Papae, and claim Vatican I essentially claims to have an episcopal power? You can go in anywhere you like and ordain anyone. Do we have any evidence of that?
Well, we have evidence for the power to do so, and that would be sufficient. But we do have evidence. We have evidence, like I adduced from Pope Martin I, who ordained John, Bishop of Philadelphia, to go into not just the episcopate, but the presbyterate and the diaconate under the See of Jerusalem and Antioch, to replace, basically to depose men who were ordained into office and replace them with those who agreed with the decrees of the Council of Lateran 649. We also have before that Pope Theodore I, who commissioned Stephen of Dor, who was a disciple of St. Sophronius of Jerusalem, to do the same, only within the See of Jerusalem. In both instances, they appeal not to canonical right or extraordinary emergency only. They appeal to the divine power that was given by Christ to St. Peter, and which was at their disposal to exercise freely. So there's that. And those are two saints, Pope Theodore and Pope Martin, preeminent saints. And we have the witness of St. Maximus, who also proclaimed very clearly that the See of Rome was authorized to judge and hear the penance of those who were converting from the monothelite heresy. I'm thinking of the life of Pyrrhus of Constantinople. We have evidence in Pope Nicholas I when he sent representatives to hear the case of Photius entering into episcopal or patriarchal office. They appealed to the canons of Sardica, but technically there was no appeal that was lodged by either Ignatius or Photius. So I would say that that's an example, of immediate action. Nicholas appealed to the authority of St. Peter. He appealed to the authority of Council of Sardica. And there was no clear rejection of that, and Rome was never required to recant from that position. So there's several other instances.
So go back to John, because the rest are sort of appeal type things and things. That was there an actual? Did he actually ordain John as the deacon of a see in Palestine?
Pope St. Martin did not ordain John Bishop of Philadelphia. He simply wrote him a letter exhorting, not charging, simply exhorting him to do something that Stephen of Dore had proven incapable of. As for what St. Maximus says about repentant monothelites going to Rome for absolution, the reason is that Jerusalem was unoccupied, while Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch were all in the hands of monothelite patriarchs. So there was really no one else to go to, as the clergy in those areas were also largely infected with it simply by tolerating their monothelite hierarchs. Just as important, going to Rome would respect the order of the traditional order, or taxis, of patriarchs.
Well, yes, and the decision to fire them from office would require the same authority to have them ordained by a representative. Of course, the Pope is not there personally to do the ordination himself. But, I mean, we see this all the way going back to the 3rd century, where Pope Stephen was consulted. I think it was Cornelius or Stephen. I'm pretty sure it was Stephen. Cyprian received letters from the bishops of Gaul about Marcianus of Arles, who had taken up the Novatian error. And Cyprian wrote to Pope Stephen so that Pope Stephen would write to the bishops of Gaul, basically mandating the excommunication of Marcianus and his replacement. And so it's not the Pope personally going there. It's not the Pope, traveling over there to do that. But he is commissioning a cessation of ordinary power. He's telling the bishops in the East, if you believe this, you don't have a job anymore, and we're going to put new people in your job. That requires jurisdiction, and it requires power, and the kind of power that they proclaimed was not from the canons, but it was from the universal pastorship that was evidenced by the New Testament with Christ and St. Peter.
The situation Mr. Ybarra is referring to is covered in letter 66 of St. Cyprian, and what he fails to mention is that the people of Arles had written to the Pope explaining that their bishops had become Novatianist schismatics. The Pope, though, did not respond, so they wrote to St. Cyprian, who writes to Pope St. Stephen explaining the situation, but not in terms of Stephen doing it alone, but rather as a synodal act, including the North African bishops. In this letter, St. Cyprian states that Marcianus, quote, does not yet seem to be excommunicated by us, end quote. Who is this us? We know it is not the royal we, because St. Cyprian addresses Stephen as you numerous times throughout it and refers to himself as I. It can only mean the episcopate as a whole. Quote, how vain it is, dearest brother, when Novatian has lately been repulsed and rejected, and excommunicated by God's priests throughout the whole world, for us still to suffer his flatterers now to jest with us, and to judge of the majesty and dignity of the Church. End quote. Notice that. St. Cyprian justifies Novatian's excommunication, not based on that by the Pope, but that novation has been excommunicated by the episcopate as a whole. The single line in the letter Mr. Ybarra is latching onto is this, quote, "Let letters be directed by you into the province and to the people abiding at Arles, by which, Marcion being excommunicated, another may be substituted in his place, and Christ's flock, which even to this day is contemned as scattered and wounded by him, may be gathered together." End quote. But Mr. Ybarra's eisegesis ignores the following verses where St. Cyprian states this is a group effort. Quote, "For that reason, dearest brother, the body of priests is abundantly large, joined together by the bond of mutual concord and the link of unity, so that if any one of our college should try to originate heresy and to lacerate and lay waste Christ's flock, others may help, as it were, as useful and merciful shepherds, gather together the Lord's sheep into the flock." End quote. This theme of a synodal and collective act flows throughout the letter. St. Cyprian continues, stating, quote, "And this ought now to be the case with us, dearest brother, that we should receive to us with ready and kindly humanity our brethren, who, tossed on the rocks of Marcion, are seeking the secure harbors of the Church, and that we afford such a place of entertainment for the travelers as is that in the gospel." End quote. To put it plainly, Stephen is the most prominent bishop in the West, and in the most prominent city in the entire empire, therefore making him a focal point of unity and communication. Notice, St. Cyprian asks that once the situation has been handled, that the name of the new bishop be sent to him for their records. Finally, the journey from Rome to Arles is much shorter and safer than the sea route from North Africa to Arles, making communication easier if Rome were to handle it. The bishops in Gaul wrote to Rome twice asking for assistance. When they did not hear back on either occasion, they wrote to St. Cyprian. What Mr. Ybarra does not understand from this is it means the bishops in Gaul did not think only Stephen could issue a deposition. If they did, they would not be writing to Cyprian. We see this same theme again in letter 67 when the clergy in 3 Spanish cities write to St. Cyprian asking for assistance in regards to 2 Spanish bishops reinstated by Rome after they had lapsed. St. Cyprian and his synod immediately deposed said bishops over and above what the Pope had decreed.
We wouldn't need a direct ordination to prove the power therein, because it would kind of be like saying, hey, Bishop Photius, prove that you have jurisdiction in your diocese. I want you to fire all your deacons and replace them tomorrow. It wouldn't be fitting, it wouldn't be appropriate to demand that kind of evidence for the bishop's ordinary jurisdiction. In the same way, I think it would be somewhat expected, and we have evidence of it, but I think it would be unfair to require as a criteria for Rome's ordinary and immediate jurisdiction, pulling the trigger on all these things that we would normally expect to be extremely rare and possibly non-existent, because Rome always supported the idea of subsidiary. Problems should always be resolved in the smallest context before they're enlarged to the next court and to the next court and then to the highest court.
In the debate review, Mr. Ybarra on 3 occasions mentions that one does not need examples from history to prove the Catholic point, but simply needs the words of Christ to St. Peter and various statements of saints, which Mr. Ybarra interprets to be pro-Vatican I. Ironically, he claims all of this while simultaneously insisting that there are a plethora of examples from history to support his point. Now, if Mr. Ybarra is correct that one does not need examples from history, but simply statements like, "Tend my sheep," or "Tend the flock assigned to you," how does he expect to understand what those statements actually mean? This is not the first time he has made this humorously naive and outright baffling claim, because we addressed it in our first video when he stated that having to prove one's point from history was a, quote, distortion. The listener can hear it for themselves. But beyond that, the ecumenical patriarch would not need to, quote, fire all of the deacons. We call that deposing. Under him, to prove he can, because the canons make it clear he can depose anyone who does not keep up the role and life of a deacon. The canons do not mention anything like that for the papacy. Ultimately, what Mr. Ybarra is arguing for might be known as a papacy of the gaps argument, in much the same way the God of the gaps argument fails. In other words, legitimate knowledge gaps in the historical record are mistakenly assumed to be proof of the papacy.
So I would say that just like the office of a bishop doesn't require New Testament evidences of bishops, deposing the deacons and replacing priests, there's simply the injunction of St. Paul to the Ephesian bishops. Take care of the flock that's been entrusted to you. That's enough. That suffices to explain that bishops have jurisdiction over their flock. In the same way, when Christ said to St. Peter, feed my sheep, that was understood by the popes to be the empowerment to jurisdiction of primacy over the whole universal church. And we do see evidences of this in many instances, but I think that personal ordinations by his own hands would be something that would be less preferred, even if he did have the power to do that, because there is a rule to the church. The church has canons, the church has rules, and the popes wanted to uphold those as best as possible, and anything extraordinary to that should be extremely rare. But nevertheless, we do see countless testimonies to the Pope having that divine power, and we also have the Pope doing actions which would require that power, which aren't precisely what you're asking for.
In 3 John, we see the community had an issue with Diotrephes, a bishop who was causing problems, and this required the intervention of St. John the Apostle, who was coming in person to handle it. Additionally, St. Ignatius, bishop of Antioch, who was martyred sometime around the year 108 AD, gives evidence of it in his 9th chapter of the letter to the Smyrnaeans, when he states the mysteries are to be celebrated only by someone approved by the bishop. It goes without saying that if one is no longer approved of by the bishop, they are no longer to celebrate the mysteries. In other words, they are deposed.
I would just say that yes, it's extraordinary, and not by way of power. It's not an extraordinary power. It's an extraordinary event, and that was what happened during the the overtake of the church by local lords and secular rulers. They were hiring their own bishops. Lay investiture was a problem. The popes were pressed against the wall to figure out how to manage the churches in the West. And they tried not to go this route, but they felt that this was the only thing they could do, and they felt empowered by an ancient principle of primacy.
Well, no, actually. They felt empowered by the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, the donation of Constantine, and the pseudo-Symachian forgeries. We have a video on this topic that came out in February 2020 that we recommend, as it presents the evidence of just how effectively the forgeries formed this new mind in Rome.
Yeah, I would say I think it's a debilitating problem in the Orthodox Church today. We're going on a century of an attempt to have a pan-Orthodox synod in order to address the many problems that plague the Orthodox Church in terms of canonical abuses and issues of doctrine. I would add. But not that we don't have our own problems in the Catholic Church. However, as Father Ratzinger said in his book, Church Politics and Ecumenism, he foresaw that the Orthodox Church would never really be able to get a pan-Orthodox synod because the criteria for such a thing is requiring cooperation with all the members and heads of the Orthodox Church. And in order to call a council without that need, you have to have a distinct, partial power of unification in a subject who can order the rest. And I think that the only ecclesiology that can suffice for that is where you have a patriarchal head who has that power of unification. You can't have the power to unify unless you have some element of coercion behind the order. If what the Patriarch of Constantinople says is a suggestion, or if he convenes a council, even if he thinks it has authority, the other heads of the church can simply say, hey, our ecclesiology on primacy hasn't been settled. The canons don't say much about this on a universal sphere. So we're just not going to go along with it. And the Orthodox Church remains divided on the issue. And it's simply that. And the Council of Crete that was attempted in 2016 is proof positive that just 4 out of the 14 autocephalous bodies could omit themselves from a pan-Orthodox synod, and that immediately demotes the council from pan-Orthodox. Now, Constantinople thinks that it's authoritative, but most of the Orthodox Church does not. So I think that the Catholic Church has the advantage, but I also think it matches the apostolic tradition that we see from the ancient principles of Petrine primacy.
Here, Mr. Ybarra is relying on the Catholic understanding of what an ecumenical council is, a council which binds the believers to certain dogmas. This is not actually what an ecumenical council is for us as Orthodox Christians. In fact, we purposefully call a specific 7 councils ecumenical, and it is most likely in remembrance of the unity Rome once shared with us. We do have dogmatically binding councils: Constantinople 879, which overturned the Antiphotian Council and barred any additions to the Creed, and we have the Council of Blachernae in 1285, which is our official response to the Filioque. We also have the Palamite Councils from 1341 through 1351, which, building upon the 6th Ecumenical Council in 681, is our official response to Thomism. We have the Council of Jassy in 1642 and the Council of Jerusalem in 1672, which are our official responses to Catholicism and Protestantism. In between those 2 councils, in 1666 through 1667, we had the Council of Moscow, which served as an almost second Trullo or Quinisext council, in that it was largely just handling canonical affairs and not dogma. We tried to have another one in 2016, but so far, only 10 of the 14 autocephalous churches have accepted it. Now, one might ask how we could have a binding council without the Pope present, because the witness of the first millennium is clear. If the Pope, along with the other patriarchates, does not ratify the council, then it cannot be considered binding upon the faithful. The answer to this comes in the form of the 5th Ecumenical Council, Constantinople II. The bishops there proceeded forward without the Pope because they had suspended Pope Vigilius from office for defending Nestorian writings. Regardless of what one thinks about this, in the 7th Ecumenical Council, we find this odd statement by the 7th Ecumenical Council. Quote, "When the Holy and Ecumenical 5th Council had assembled at Constantinople, a common and universal anathema was imposed on Origen and Theodore of Mopsuestia, and on the teachings of Evagrius and Didymus on preexistence and a universal restoration, in the presence and with the approval of the 4 patriarchs." End quote. Notice, only 4 patriarchs are mentioned. In the eyes of the fathers at Constantinople II and the fathers at Nicaea II, the Roman See was simply vacant at that point. This is one reason why the Orthodox Church can still have dogmatically binding councils, because the seat of Rome, in our eyes, is vacant. Furthermore, in the first millennium, the Pope calling a council did not gather much in terms of bishops. Case in point, the Lateran Council of 649 was called by the Pope without imperial backing. It drew roughly only 105 bishops, all of which were from Italy, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and a couple regions of Africa. Only one bishop, Stephen of Dora, was from outside those areas, and he was from Palestine. In fact, the council was so desperate to present itself as ecumenical and trying to show off Roman prestige that of the 4 letters it presents at the council, 2 were not even written to the council, but were written years before to the Pope. We recommend the listener read our article entitled does the Lateran Council of 649 prove papal infallibility?
Catholics claim orthodoxy is divided, yet you have multiple different theologies through your admittance of Eastern Catholics who hold views that contradict Rome. How can you condemn heretics like Nestorians when they're in your church?
The issue of the Nestorians, they may be. We don't invite Nestorians. We don't invite people into the church to reject the decrees of any of the ecumenical councils, one of which condemned Nestorius very clearly. So he may be referring to the fact that certain Eastern churches have been allowed, for some reason, to uphold a memory of Nestorius. He's certainly not a canonized saint in the Catholic Church, but this is a problem that would probably need to be kicked up to Rome to look at more closely. However, the Orthodox Church as well, is dealing with certain issues on this in terms of, I wouldn't look at David Bentley Hart, who just received the Patristics Award for the year 2019, who's openly Orthodox and never disciplined by any cleric in the Orthodox Church, as an indication that the Orthodox Church now allows universalism and his sort of dissidence.
But we do not have an anaphora named the Anaphora of St. David Bentley Hart, and God forbid if we did, it would be universally hated, pun intended. But seriously, the Assyrian Church of the East, also known as Nestorians, has 3 anaphoras that are used. For those not familiar with the Eastern tradition, the anaphora corresponds to the canon of the Mass in the West. The first is the anaphora of Mari and Addai. The second is the anaphora of Mar Nestorius, who was condemned at Ephesus in 431 and died in 451. The third is the anaphora of Mar Theodore, named after Theodore of Mopsuestia, who died in 428 and was condemned in 553 at Constantinople too. In Assyrian Aramaic, the prefix Mar means saint or lord, and is applied onto the names of saints and living hierarchs. When the Chaldean Catholics were accepted in, they were allowed to continue using the anaphoras of Nestorius and Theodore of Mopsuestia, though the Chaldean Catholics in the U.S. only use the anaphora of Mari and Addai. Further, under Pope John Paul II and the Nestorian Catholicos Mardinka IV, the Catholic Church reopened a contingent communion between the Chaldean Catholics and the Nestorians after an agreed Christological statement in 1994. This agreed statement is entitled Common Christological Declaration between the Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East. Now, a link to this declaration is provided in the video description below. But when the declaration comes to the topic of the anathema and veneration of Nestorius, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and other heretics, it states, quote, "The controversies of the past led to anathemas bearing on persons and on formulas. The Lord's Spirit permits us to understand better today that the divisions brought about in this way were due in large part to misunderstandings." End quote. In other words, the Pope signed a declaration claiming that the doctrinal statements produced by the Third, Fourth, and Fifth Ecumenical Councils were mistaken, not to mention the repetition of those statements and the theology built upon them by the Sixth and Seventh Ecumenical Councils.
What evidence would you need to see or to convince you that Catholicism or Orthodoxy, respectively, or vice versa, I guess, depending on who's answered, is true?
That's a good question. So what I would want is for Orthodoxy's principles to be consistently upheld by the Scripture and the tradition as evidenced in history, church fathers and ecumenical councils. What I see all over the place in the first millennium are countless saints who teach something that's absolutely contradictory to modern day Orthodox teaching. And that is that the See of Rome was the principle of unity, had a power of unification, which consisted of jurisdiction divinely given back during the apostolic time given to St. Peter by Christ, and divinely irreversible in the Roman Church. That is proclaimed too often and by too many saints It's echoed in ecumenical councils, as I brought out. It's recognized by Protestant and Orthodox scholars. At the very least, you have a great division in the patristic evidence. And if that division is so egregious that history no longer becomes a good compass to follow towards the truth, then both the Catholic and the Orthodox and anybody else is really debilitated when it comes to finding the truth through history. So I think the Orthodox Church really suffers from its claim that Rome was like the preeminent see of the first millennium, and then it fell in the 11th century, when scholars today all recognize that those claims in the 11th century were already being claimed in the early centuries of the church. I quoted Archbishop Stylianus Harkiniakis of Australia. He's a scholar, Orthodox scholar. He admitted this goes back to Stephen. Father Lauren Clearnwork admitted goes back to Victor. Father Alexander Schmemann admitted the formula of Hormisdas is the essence of the papal doctrine. So you have a division in the history of the church. I think the greater probability is that the Catholic faith is true. If the Orthodox understanding of ecclesiology had the majority of the fathers and the councils, then I think I would consider orthodoxy more.
Notice how Erick Ybarra has now reinterpreted what Father Kleinwerk, Archbishop Stanley, Father Schmemann, etc. had said to align with his own views. They never said the papacy was present, only that seeds which would later develop into it were there. Later in the debate review video, Erick does this twice more, showing he either has memory problems or is simply lying. But the opinion of a couple of priests and bishops pales in comparison to that of a pope. You will recall that we had brought up both the Ravenna and Chieti documents, both of which will be linked below, and we encourage you to read them for yourselves, as both are good examples of the Pope's hand-picked scholars conceding the past was not Vatican I or Satis Cognitum. But even before that, we have Pope Emeritus Benedict the 26th stating the Orthodox Church is the original church. In the first, the interviewer asks the then Father Joseph Ratzinger, who at the time was head or prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, better known as the Roman Inquisition. The interviewer asks him what relations are like with the Orthodox churches, and Cardinal Ratzinger states, quote, "Contacts with them are only superficially easier. In reality, we are faced with grave problems. These churches have an authentic doctrine, but it is static, petrified as it were. They remain faithful to the tradition of the first Christian millennium, but they reject later developments on the grounds that Catholics decided upon these developments without them. For them, questions of faith can only be decided by a really ecumenical council, in other words, one which includes all Christians." End quote. The other is the so-called Ratzinger formula, which he also proposed while prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. Quote, "Rome must not require more from the East with respect to the doctrine of primacy than what had been formulated and was lived in the first millennium. Rome need not ask for more. Reunion could take place in this context if, on the one hand, the East would cease to oppose as heretical the developments which took place in the West in the second millennium, and would accept the Catholic Church as legitimate and orthodox in the form she had acquired in the course of that development, while, on the other hand, the West would recognize the Church of the East as orthodox and legitimate in the form she has always had." End quote. Pope Benedict then re-proposed this idea while Pope, so it was not something he had left in the past. Now, granted, he shut down attempts at the Melkites to do the same thing in 2005, but never dropped the above formula as a bridge to reunion with the Orthodox churches.
As a closing remark, I would simply say that in my opening statement, I brought many examples from the church fathers, the bishops of councils, and decrees of ecumenical councils that testify to the four parts of the Vatican decree. When Catholics say that the successor of Peter has ordinary and immediate jurisdiction, we simply mean that Christ gave to St. Peter this power without any intermediation. So it wasn't a power that was given to the church first and then given to the Bishop of Rome or then given to Peter. It was given directly to St. Peter. And a lot of the testimonies I brought out bore that testimony out. And as I was saying before, Protestant Orthodox scholars recognize that. Today, scholars recognize that there is sort of a two distinct ecclesiologies, roughly speaking, that developed in the early centuries and eventually, grew into the division that came about in the second millennium. However, I would say that the orthodoxy of Elder Rome being superior, and Orthodox theologians have recognized this, that the saints all looked to Rome in the first millennium as a bulwark of orthodoxy. Its constant tradition on this matter is unmistakable, unambiguous. And if we were to X off half the church in order to preserve the Orthodox truth today, then I think we're undercutting too much, and we're falsifying both Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So I think that none of the opening statement remarks I made were really dealt with, especially the Formula of Hormisdas, which doesn't just have a few acceptances. It was accepted by many, many bishops in the East, many bishops in the West, and it was signed again and again in other times of reunion between the East and the West. So I would simply, and also some of the objections we heard about, the appeals court and Cyprian of Carthage, the evidences I adduced from other saints were not dealt with. It was as if Cyprian should be the house that wins all, but it's very clear that so many other fathers and councils contradicted that. And so I don't think that was adequately dealt with. And in terms of evidence, I don't believe that finding evidence of the Pope going out and being Rambo on all the churches in the East and ordaining clerics at a whim and, taking his horse and going around all over the East to ordain bishops and clerics is the bare minimum criteria. All you need is Christ established Peter as the primate. That primacy is indefectible and irreversible. It's fixed in the Roman See, and it involves jurisdiction and supremely authoritative teaching. All those four elements are the bare minimum evidence you would need, and we have so many testimonies in that regard. The bishops of the Orthodox Church themselves agreed to this, partially in 1274, but even more substantially at the Council of Florence in the 15th century. Father mentioned how he doesn't want an autocratic will who can change things left, right, and whenever. But the popes have always worked in tandem with bishops, and even with Eastern Orthodox bishops, but the Orthodox bishops never sustained those decrees because they've redeveloped an idea for an epistemological recognition of councils and ecclesial authority, which today is debilitating the Orthodox Church completely because it can't take the first step to making a universal resolution on a single matter.
First, I do not know if Mr. Ybarra has memory issues or just likes to lie, but he makes the humorous statement that, quote, the saints all looked to Rome in the first millennium as a bulwark of orthodoxy, end quote. If this were the case, it would not have suspended Pope Vigilius from office at the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553. Additionally, they would have not sided with St. Photius when he excommunicated Pope Nicholas I in 867, or when he returned after the death of St. Ignatius in 877, and again at the Council of Constantinople in 879, when he insisted on keeping the Filioque out of the Creed. To say the East saw Rome as general Orthodox is fair. To say they saw Rome as always a bulwark of orthodoxy is just a fantasy. Second, Mr. Ybarra states that the bishops of the Orthodox Church agreed to his 4 points in 1274 at Second Lyon and in 1439 at Ferrara, Florence. On the topic of Ferrara, Florence, if you have not already, we would encourage you to watch our video from March 2021 entitled Vatican Catholic Refuted on Orthodoxy and Ecumenical Councils, When LARPing Goes Wrong, which deals with the claim that the Council of Florence is ecumenical for us. It was not, as only 2 patriarchates ratified it, while 4 rejected it. So no, this was not accepted by our bishops. As mentioned earlier, we have had a series of pan-Orthodox councils since the schism and made numerous decisions, so Mr. Ybarra is either ignorant or lying there, but most likely both. In conclusion, we want to thank you for watching this video, and we are honored that you are one of our Patreon subscribers. As a Patreon subscriber, you have unique access to material no one else does, and are able to message us with questions whenever you have them. We look forward to continually providing you with more videos here and more materials on our blog.